Hello YouTube, my name is Josh and I want to welcome you to our channel. So Flickstiq is all about game streaming and cloud gaming, and today we're here to talk about measuring input latency. So what that basically means is we're measuring the amount of delay that you experience when you push a button or click your mouse and then see your action take place in your game. And when you have high input latency, it's going to affect how you play. So that could make you miss that perfect headshot, could make you overshoot a goal, things like that. It's not a pleasant experience, so you want your input latency to be as low as possible, and we're going to show you how you can measure yours to see whether yours is already low, or whether it's really high, or whether it's right where it could be, or should be. And that'll give you some information in terms of maybe troubleshooting, or just knowing that maybe that's not your whole problem, maybe you just have trouble with your game. I know that's true for me sometimes. So we'll see. But basically, in terms of measuring your input latency, you need a few tools. The first thing that you'll need is a camera that's capable of shooting 60 frames per second. Now for us here in our test, we're going to be using our iPhone. And our iPhone, in our settings, we can go ahead and set it to 60 frames per second in the camera app settings. And you can probably do the same thing on a lot of Android phones. However, if you want to do this test for yourself, you don't have any camera right now that can shoot 60 frames per second, you'll find a link in the description for a Logitech webcam that is able to do that. It's also just a great camera to boot, and it's less expensive than upgrading your phone or just going out and getting some sort of professional camera for this test. So you'll get a good webcam out of it and a tool that'll work for this purpose. So that's in the description. So here's kind of the setup. This is how it works. What we do first is we run a baseline test. So we want to measure any kind of inherent latency in our system without streaming. To do that, we're going to run a game. So for our purposes, we're using a game called BRIO. We're using it for a few reasons. One is that it's extremely lightweight, should run even on laptops and things like that that are not made for gaming. And you want to get a baseline measurement of your input latency to be able to have a starting point. So what is your latency without even streaming? So we want to get a number and kind of put a number to that as a first step. And then our second step is to run the exact same game from a cloud server and stream it back to ourselves and do the same test again, basically measure that latency one more time, and then we subtract the numbers. And so, I'll give you an example. So let's say that BRIO for you, when you test it on your system at home, you install it, you run it, let's say that your latency at the end of the day is 10 milliseconds, all right? So that's what it feels like to play natively on your computer, 10 milliseconds. Well, maybe when you add cloud gaming to the mix, your latency that you get when you test the cloud gaming side is 25 milliseconds, all right? So if that's true, then cloud gaming adds 15 milliseconds of extra delay to your experience, and so that's your cloud gaming measurement. And that's just an example. We'll show you in detail how to do that and how we do it. And at the end of the day, you'll be able to do this for yourself, find out what your numbers look like, and maybe even compare different services, because sometimes that's a factor. So maybe one service has higher input latency for you than another service does. That could be a factor in your decision in terms of picking companies. So let's jump right into it. Our first step is setting up our little test system. We're going to run a baseline test first, and then we'll come back, run the exact same test on the cloud server, measure those results, and see what we get. That's coming up next. Now we're ready to run our baseline test. So all that we're doing for this test, and you'll see a lot of it already laid out in front of me, go ahead and get your camera set up so that it's pointed right at the screen of your computer and get it ready to shoot. So the iPhone is set up right here. It's in 60 FPS mode, so it's shooting 60 frames per second, and I've got my game loaded up on the computer back here. Now keep in mind, for this test, we're running on the computer itself. So this is actually installed on the computer that's here with us at home, and I've got my controller connected to that computer right here. So here's all that we're going to do. We're going to make sure that we can see both the game and the controller on our camera, and all that we're going to do is shoot a video of pushing a button. So for this example, I'm going to shoot a video of making the guy jump, just like this. And when that's done, we'll analyze that video frame by frame to measure how much latency happened between my button push and the action on the screen. So let's go ahead and start shooting the video, and we'll see what we get. And just make sure you have a really clear image of both the button and the character in your shot. All right, that's it. So we got our shot. Now we're ready to actually break that into a number, and that's coming up next. Now we're actually ready to use some tools on the computer to measure our input latency from the videos that we shot. So what you're going to do is start off by installing the QuickTime Player on your computer. If you're on a Mac, you should already have it installed. If you're on Windows, you'll find a link for it in the description below. Go ahead and install that program, and then when you're done with that, copy your video files from your camera to your computer. And then once they're on the computer, you're going to right-click on your baseline footage. So for me, I called it native. So this is the footage where the game itself is running on the computer. This is not being streamed. And we're using this as our baseline to get a basic number that represents what this computer does natively. So go ahead and right click on that video, go to Open With, and then choose QuickTime Player. From here, go ahead and maximize the video if you need to, just kind of get it centered like I just did. Just hit the little maximize button right there. And then we're going to advance the video to the point of where the thumb is about to push the button all the way down. So just doing that slowly. Okay. So the cool thing about QuickTime is that you can use the arrow keys on the keyboard to advance the video one frame at a time. So I'm using the right arrow key to do this right now. So we're just looking for the button to be completely depressed, and once it is, we're going to start counting frames to measure our latency. So I'm just looking for the button to completely disappear. Okay. So let's see. I'm just kind of looking at the motion, and you can look with me, but it looks like this is the point where it's completely depressed, and then we've got one frame. So it looks like on the very next frame we see action on the screen. So let's go back through that real quick. So backing up, I'm using the left arrow key to back up. So my thumb is clearly going down, clearly going down, clearly going down. All right, so going, depressed, and then there's the action right there. So you can tell that this has one frame, and one frame is basically our delay between when the button's depressed and when you actually see the action on the screen. So let's talk about how we take that one frame of difference that we noticed there and turn that into milliseconds of latency. Alright, so here's how the math works. You take your number of frames that you counted. So we had one frame in our counting that we just did. You're going to divide that number by 60. So divide by 60 equals, and then multiply your results by 1,000. And then equals again. So this is your milliseconds of input latency. So we have 16 milliseconds of input latency, and that's our native input latency for this computer and this game. So that's our baseline is 16. Now let's do the same test with our cloud footage and see what the difference is. Now we fired up a cloud server over at Paperspace, and we're currently using Parsec to stream that server from the web to our computer here at home. So we're testing on the same computer, same monitor, but this time we're not running the game natively. It's actually being streamed to us, and we're going to run the same test so that we can get a number for this computer and then measure the numbers together to see exactly how much latency is added by playing in the cloud. So let's go ahead and do the same thing. We're just going to grab our controller, bring it up so that we can see it clearly on the screen, so we can see both the character and the controller, and let's start recording. And all we're going to do is the same thing. And that's basically it. Now we're going to take those results and we're going to compare them and see exactly how much latency is basically measured between the two. So let's jump right into editing and comparing. Alright, so we're going to do the exact same thing. Go ahead and right click on your cloud video. So this is the video that you shot of the cloud server that you're playing on. Go to Open With, and then go to QuickTime Player. And then same deal as before, let's go ahead and get it centered. And same deal as before, advance the video to the point of where the thumb is about to depress the button. Okay. So let's back it up just a hair so we can do this a little bit slower. So he's getting ready to push the button down. I'm using my right arrow key to keep pushing. So we're waiting for that button to be completely depressed. Okay, so it's completely depressed right here. Now we start measuring the number of frames that we can get before we see action on the screen. So we got 1, 2, 3. All right, so we had 3 frames of difference. So let's go ahead and close that down, and we're going to do the math. All right, so let's run those numbers again, this time for the cloud server. So we're going to go 3 divided by 60 equals, and then multiply that by 1,000 equals. And we get 50. So that means that we have a total of 50 milliseconds of input latency. But if you remember, our baseline profile is that even without streaming, we still have 16 milliseconds of input latency. So we're going to subtract 16 from this number. And that tells us that the cloud adds 34 milliseconds of input latency to the entire experience. So let's talk about those results. All right, so those are some interesting numbers. Now let's put those in perspective though, because some people are going to start screaming right away, 50 milliseconds is way too high, it's unplayable. But consider a few things. So the PlayStation 3, if you remember, that's not that long ago. That console, if you're just navigating the menu system before you even jumped into a game, had 50 milliseconds of input latency. That was its native, without streaming of any sort. And if you remember the Xbox 360, remember a very popular game called Halo 3? Well, Halo 3 has an actual native input latency of 133 milliseconds. So if you did the same test where you measured the frames, Halo 3 has 8 frames between when a button is pressed and when you see action on the screen. So if you do the same math, that's 133 milliseconds of input latency. So hopefully that kind of puts this into perspective a little bit. So if we're only adding 34 milliseconds of input latency when we're playing in the cloud, that's extremely playable. That's even more playable than natively playing on the last generation of consoles. So that's pretty awesome in my opinion. And I'd be really curious to see what kind of results you guys get. So do the same test if you have the equipment to do so, and let me know in the comments what kind of response you guys get, what kind of numbers you guys are able to generate. I'm curious to see what you get for different services and whether your results are very similar to what I just showed you. And that's basically it for this video. If you have any questions about the whole process, let me know in the comments. And as always, if this sort of thing interests you, so if you're into cloud gaming or you're willing to kind of start your cloud gaming or game streaming journey, consider subscribing. This is basically the best place to be to learn everything that you could possibly want to know about game streaming and cloud gaming. And until next time, you guys have a good one.